Biographer Kai Bird published The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter in 2021. Kai is a prolific author, most notably of American Prometheus, The Triumph and Tragedy of J. Robert Oppenheimer, which earned he and his co-author a Pulitzer Prize in 2006 and became a major motion picture in 2023. I got a chance to talk with Kai about the role he sees biographers playing in the formation of collective memory.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear. The time for racial discrimination is over. That I will faithfully execute
an undiminished, ever-expanding American dream.
The office of President of the United States.
The struggle for human rights overrides all differences of color or nation or language.
And will, to the best of my ability,
it is a crisis of confidence.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
To remove the light of war, the threat of war, would be the overwhelming dream that I would have.
The Constitution of the United States.
We will not learn how to live together in peace by killing each other's children.
So help me God.
My name is Kai Bird. I'm the executive director of the Leon Center for Biography at City University in New York. And I'm a biographer. I've written 5 biographies and a memoir. And my last biography was on Jimmy Carter. And I guess my most famous biography is American Prometheus, co-authored with Martin Sherwin, which is the biography of J. Robert Oppenheimer, and was the basis for the Christopher Nolan film that came out last year.
I'm sure that kind of attention, draws a lot of prominence, draws a lot of opportunities. You won the Pulitzer for that book. I'm interested to know why you were interested in writing about Carter. You could probably choose anyone that you wanted to write about. So why Carter and why in 2020 era?
Well, I've always been interested in Carter. He was the first president I could vote for when I was a young man back in 1976. And I was an editor at The Nation magazine in the late 70s, early 80s. We always sort of were curious about Carter. We thought, The Nation is quite liberal, and we thought Carter wasn't liberal enough. But he was obviously a very interesting and singular American politician. And I was just curious about all sorts of things from, where he had come from to what kind of a Southern liberal was he and why he didn't get reelected. So in 1990, a long time ago, I actually explored the notion of doing a biography of Jimmy Carter. This is right after my first biography on John J. McCloy. And I did so by writing a cover magazine story in The Nation about what Jimmy Carter was doing with his ex-presidency. He had just opened the Carter Center in 1990. And so I went down to Georgia, spent 2 weeks interviewing a number of his people at the Carter Center. I had a telephone interview with Carter himself. And I wrote the magazine story, but I left Georgia thinking that I was the wrong guy to do a biography of Jimmy Carter. I didn't understand what a foreign country it was down there. I didn't understand their accent. I didn't understand Southern Baptist. I didn't understand race and its role in Southern culture. And I came back and I told my wife that if I were to do a biography of Jimmy Carter, I'd have to move to Plains, Georgia, and spend a couple of years peeping into this foreign country like a foreign correspondent would. And my wife said, no way. I backed off the project, but I was always curious about it, and I came back to it many books later in 2015 and decided that I really wanted to do a president, and Carter was still mystery to me. And I wrote a proposal, and That same month that I sold the book proposal to a New York publisher, Carter had his famous press conference in which he came out and announced that he had brain cancer. And I thought, oh, I'm never going to get a chance to see the man, talk to him. But as we all know, he survived brain cancer and is still with us to this very day. He's approaching his 100th birthday on October 1st. Spent 6 years working on the Carter biography, and it came out in 2021.
Yeah, so the biography is called The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. I'm really interested in both aspects of that title, but I think we'll start with the first. So, The Outlier. Why do you see Carter as an outlier?
Well, it just seemed very obvious to me that, he was a Southern man, but a liberal in the South in the 1950s and 60s. He was an interesting politician, very wily, clever. Even, Hunter Thompson, the famous Rolling Stone journalist who became quite close to Carter in the 70s, called him ruthless, the most ruthless politician he'd ever met. And yet, of course, we all see Jimmy Carter today as one of the most decent politicians in American history, certainly in the 20th century. And so I always thought that he ran as a governor, as an outlier. He was always surprising his constituency. He was a Southern man, Southern white man, but he was extremely liberal in his positions on race and religion, separation of church and state. And he improbably won the White House in 1976, coming from nowhere, so to speak. And then he proceeded to govern as an outlier. He told his wife, Rosie, that he wasn't going to take political factors into his decision-making. He was going to do the right thing. He was going to just try to figure out what was the right thing to do, study the issue, and do the right thing. And this, again, made him an outlier. So I thought it was a good title, and it captured his personality, his relentlessness. He was an outlier in that way, too. Then the subtitle, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter, I thought appropriated well because, of course, he had only one term, so his presidency as such was unfinished. And the subtitle sort of hints at what he did with the rest of his life, which is he really extended his presidency into his ex-presidency, working very hard on the same issues that had captivated him during his White House years: Middle East peace, health issues, wiping out guinea worm disease in Africa. Again, trying to do the right thing and not just use his ex-presidency to take $1 million checks for giving speeches.
Yeah, a common phrase used about Carter is good man, but not a great president.
He hates that.
Right. And so much of my interest in doing this podcast has been to explore that phrase that's really a maxim for many, especially from the conservative side. With you having done extensive research on Carter, what's your assessment of that phrase?
Well, he did have a very successful and model ex-presidency, and he is very much a decent man. But it's a myth that his presidency was a failure. He actually had a quite consequential 4 years in the White House, and he dealt with many of the same issues that are still relevant today, from energy to race to religion to climate change, healthcare. And during his White House years, he actually got quite a lot done, from the relatively minor thing of deregulating the alcohol industry so that boutique beer brewery could pop up in every American city. And Americans today are drinking good beer instead of watered down Budweiser. He also saved 10,000 lives a year to this day by passing seatbelt and airbag legislation. He deregulated the trucking industry. He deregulated the airlines, which allowed for the first time for middle-class Americans to fly on their Thanksgiving vacations or Christmas holidays. Before that, Americans would drive. During the Carter presidency and afterwards, middle-class Americans began to fly in large numbers. He passed the Alaska Land Act. He appointed more African Americans than women to the federal bench than all of his predecessors combined. He created the modern vice presidency, moving the vice president's office into the White House ground. And on foreign policy, he had a long list of achievements, from the Panama Canal Treaty to arms negotiations to normalization of diplomatic relations with China, immigration reform, and of course, he made human rights in foreign policy a keystone of U.S. foreign policy, and it has remained so ever since. And of course, he did this extraordinary negotiation at Camp David over 13 days in September 1978, where most improbably, due to his very personal diplomacy, he brought together Egypt's Anwar Sadat and Israel's Menachem Begin and hammered out, really arm wrestled them into a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which survives to this day. But I have to say also that, his failures are just as interesting as his success. He negotiated the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, but he also thought he had gotten an agreement with Menachem Begin to address Palestinian self-determination. And of course, Begin, as we now know, reneged on that part of the negotiations. And so we're now, as a result, dealing with the Palestinian-Israeli conundrum to this day. He then, of course, his presidency was probably in large measure brought down by the Iran hostage crisis, 444 days. And again, this is an interesting aspect of his presidency. He probably could have ended this crisis by bombing the hell out of Iran or mining harbors, but he felt that that would endanger the lives of the hostages, and he was determined to bring them back. So again, he sort of did the right thing at great political cost and relied on diplomacy. And this, led to the perception in the 1980 presidential campaign against Ronald Reagan that Carter was the weaker of the two. As we know, he lost in the landslide in that 1980 election.
What do you think are some of the factors that feed in to our collective memory of Carter today, especially the presidency, which, as you just said, was much more consequential than is commonly remembered? But why do we remember Carter the way that we do?
Well, Americans have a short historical memory. And Carter's presidency was, more than 40 years ago now. The younger generation has no knowledge of it personally. The older generation of Americans, again, remember Carter in sort of his stereotype images, is sitting in a sweater in front of a fireplace, lecturing us about how to save energy. And they remember the Iran hostage crisis and those helicopters that went down in a failed rescue mission. They don't remember the victories and the consequential decisions that he made that actually changed the economy and, much of American culture for the better. If you pick up the Outlier, most readers will be astonished at the history that they don't know. But in fact, Carter is looking better and better these days, certainly in the eyes of historians. He, in my view, was absolutely the most intelligent, hardworking, and decent man to have occupied the Oval Office in the 20th century. He kept farmer hours. He got up at 5:30 in the morning. He was in the Oval Office by 6 or 6:30, and he worked 12 hours a day and read 300 memos every day, 200 to 300 pages of memos. He paid attention to the details. He was hardworking, and you would think that this is a quality that we would want in our presidency. I think history will judge Jimmy Carter as the president ahead of his time, somewhat of a prophet about climate change, about solar panels on the roof of the White House, a prophet in terms of what was necessary to bring peace to the Middle East. And he was willing to tackle the tough, unpopular issues like the Panama Canal Treaty or Middle East peace, despite the political consequences, the political costs, which he knew were going to be heavy. I understand there were sort of suspicions and misunderstandings during his presidency. As I said earlier, Northern liberals didn't quite know what to make of this Southern liberal. And there was a language gap and a cultural gap. And, Carter took his religion very seriously and applied it. And yet, America is in many ways a secular society. And yet Carter is quite interesting in that he was adamant about maintaining a separation of church and state. And again, this is an issue that has become relevant in our times where there seems to be slippage on that.
Certainly. And, I think a lot of my own interest in exploring Carter came about with seeing the way that he has been maligned in many news outlets, especially conservative. I'm interested as we wrap up to ask you, what role do you think biography, or even yourself as a biographer, play in shaping collective memory? If you had a hope for how your biography of Carter might change the way that we remember him, what would it be?
Well, biography, I would argue, is the most arduous form of scholarship. It's unending. Most biographies take the biographer at least 5 years to research and write, and often many more years. My first biography took 10 years. Carter biography took 6. It's a very difficult form of scholarship, but it is also storytelling. It's a story of one person's life. And for that reason, it can be very powerful. It can be a page turner. We're all curious about our individual lives. And if you take a character like Jimmy Carter and follow him through his own life, you learn a lot of history and context about not only the issues, but the culture, the time. And it's a powerful tool for human understanding. And people, I would argue, should read more biography. They would find it pleasurable, and they would find it engrossing, and they would learn a lot along the way, a lot of history that they otherwise would not read. So biography is an essential tool for human understanding, for understanding our human condition.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for coming on the show and sharing about your biography of President Carter. I really appreciate it. Recollecting Carter is produced by me, Jason Lee Guthrie, with support from Georgia Humanities and the Liebner Cooper Family Foundation. Original music and sound design by Joel Corey. Logo design by Whitney Matheson. Archival media provided by the Carter Center. Special thanks to my intern Michael Smith and my students at Clayton State University who have contributed to this podcast. You can connect with the show online at recollectingcarter.com.